Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming. My name is DeWitt Godfrey. I teach sculpture here in the Art and Art History Department, and it's my pleasure to direct the speaker and gallery series this year. I'd like to welcome you all back to the extension of a residency by Josh McPhee called Graphic Liberation: Perspectives on Image Making and Political Movements. We're exploring the role of culture and social movements in the history and evolutionary usage of political graphics. In just a few weeks, Josh will actually physically be here in residence. We've extended his residency from last year through this fall and the coming spring. And he'll be on campus from the 13th of October through the 20th. And that on the 20th, we'll be having an opening reception and a gallery talk in the Clifford Gallery. In the Clifford Gallery, they will host workshops in the context of an exhibition of historical political graphics, turning the Clifford Gallery into a space of creativity, production, and resistance. Through a series of open hours, workshops, and other kinds of activities, students, faculty, staff, and community members are invited and encouraged to use this hands-on workspace to make their own political graphics using templates, tools, and risograph printing technology. We're hoping that it'll be an evolving and dynamic residency, exhibition, and workspace. Last semester, students in Professor Bryn Hatton's and Professor Lynn Schwartzer's classes produced zines based on their research in 19th and 20th century political graphics. Just an example of the kind of thing that we hope this residency will generate. As we get a final schedule of workshops and other events during the residency, we'll keep you updated. Today, we're resuming our series of conversations with distinguished political graphics producers, welcoming Daniel Drennan El-Awar, founder of the collective Jamaa Al-Yad, in dialogue with Josh McPhee, our Christian A. Johnson artist in residence. Following their conversations, we will have time for follow-up questions. For those of you on Zoom, please use the Q&A feature to post your questions, and I'll moderate those questions from the podium. Josh McPhee is a designer, artist, and archivist. He's a founding member of both the Just Seeds Artist Cooperative and Interference Archive, a public collection of cultural materials produced by social movements based in Brooklyn, New York. McPhee is the author and editor of numerous publications, including Signs of Change, Social Movement Cultures, 1960s to Now, and Signal, a journal of international political graphics and culture. He's organized the Celebrate People's History poster series since 1998 and has been designing book covers for many publishers for the past decade. Daniel Drennan El-Awar, who we're pleased to welcome today, is an illustrator and printmaker who works with documentary genre. His work focuses primarily on issues of displacement, dispossession, and disinheritance. Drennan El-Awar attended Syracuse University and later Parsons School of Design, both New York and Paris campuses. In 2009, he founded a Beirut-based artist collective, Jamaa Al-Yad, which produces posters, calligraphy, and other artworks of this social activist nature. The collective's work has been exhibited at the Queens Museum and the Museum of Modern Art, along with other international venues. He was formerly associate art director of Saveur magazine in New York City, and most recently worked as an assistant professor of graphic design at the American University of Beirut, where he lived for 12 years. Please join me in welcoming Josh and Daniel.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you, DeWitt and Sarah and everyone at Colgate and at the Art and Art History Department. And thank you so much, Daniel, for being here with me this afternoon. A couple quick things. One, to all the students that are there on campus and also joining by Zoom, I will be there on Colgate campus for about 10 days, starting on October 13th. And I would love to meet up with any of you that are interested in these issues, are working on political issues on campus, and are looking for new and interesting ways to make art and culture around those issues. Like, I would love to just chat and hear what people are up to, and also get people into this gallery space that we're going to turn into a little print shop. So I welcome you all to that. And then this Graphic Liberation Conversation series is ongoing, and the next talk conversation is going to be on November 3rd, the first Wednesday in November, with Tomia Arai. And Tomia is an amazing muralist and graphics producer, and currently a core member of a group called the Chinatown Art Brigade, and she's been making radical work in, around, and about Chinatown and Asian American issues now for 50 years. So I encourage everyone to tune into that conversation because I think it's going to be really interesting. So yeah, let's jump into this. First, I just wanted to say that I'm calling in from Brooklyn, which is Lenape Canarsie land historically. And I just want to honor the land that I'm on and the people that this land was taken from, in hopes that we will all collectively develop a system to return that land back and figure out how we can live and exist and coexist on this land in a way that isn't based on violence and destruction. So yeah, let's jump into this. The way that we do this, and we've been doing this is the fifth of the series, is that I'm going to throw up a series of slides, 4 images that Daniel sent me. He's going to talk about them very briefly, and that's just going to give us a sort of visual point of reference for the conversation as we move forward. Because I really want everyone to pay attention to what's being said rather than getting sort of lost in imagery. So we'll just ground some images and then from there be able to jump into the talk. So we're going to start here, and I don't know if you want to just jump in and give us a brief overview of these images, and just let me know when you want me to move on to the next one.
Sure. Well, first, thank you for having me, and thanks to Colgate University. I'm coming to you from what we know now as Vancouver, the occupied lands of the Coast Salish peoples, and their resistance here is every day an inspiration to me. So this image, this was a follow-up to the Great March of Return that took place. All of the nation states, as we know them today, surrounding Palestine, organized marches to the border in order to protest for return and liberation of the land. And there was 70,000 Palestinians and their supporters from the refugee camps in Lebanon who went down to the border by bus. There was a series of posters that was developed for that. And the day started out quite, I want to say joyous, almost euphoric. Everyone, people who had not left their camps within visual distance of their homeland was quite phenomenal. And the only issue was that it was a little bit too much. A lot of the, especially the young people, but a lot of people started making their way down to the border fence. And at a certain point, we noticed that there was a smoke screen going up on the other side. And then it became quickly obvious that some snipers were coming into position, and 12 young men lost their lives as they were killed while protesting on the Lebanese side of the border. As a follow-up, the march obviously needed to end at that point, and we made our ways back to Beirut. But as a follow-up, we produced this poster. It was produced rather quickly. It was carved into a curved piece of butcher block that I happened to have that was not useful anymore in the kitchen. And it was based on a photo of a woman who was taking the symbolic action of throwing a stone across the border. And what you see in the background are young men literally moving tank mines and barbed wire in order to get close to the border. And the poster reads in Arabic, "The people demand their return to Palestine, and return is but a stone's throw away." If you want to move on, we can. This was a quite recent project that we did. We were asked to contribute something to l'Institut du Monde Arabe in Paris, the Institute of of the Arab world asked us to contribute something to a book they were working on with the rather annoying title of Does the Arab World Still Exist? And we wanted to respond quite definitively that yes, that the reality day to day goes on, no matter how it's mediated in upper levels or in other nation states. And we were working with some embroiderers from Greater Syria, so women from Syria located in Lebanon, Palestinians also located in Lebanon, as well as Lebanese embroiderers. And it was a collaborative project in which we took the square Kufic Arabic for Thawra Hatta Nasr, which means revolution until victory. And we asked them to embellish it with their own designs. And it was supposed to turn into a long-term project of collaboration, but also helping them with their cottage industry, if you will, and getting word out and kind of turning it into a small productive force. But COVID interrupted, and that needed to end. But this was the image that we worked on, one of the women working in her house. You can move on. This was from a series of posters that we did in 2015. My colleague and dear friend Tariq Mahmoud in Beirut was writing a play about the premise of the play was the return of Malcolm X to the region after he had been there decades earlier, but also commemorating the anniversary of his assassination. And so we did a series of posters, a lot of research. We designed a logo. We took some of his statements and quotations, translated them into Arabic. There was a theater play, as well as a lecture. And so a whole series of events, including interviewing the woman who was responsible for getting him onto the campus of the American University in Beirut, where he was at first banned from speaking. And so the 5 posters that were produced kind of give an overview of him during this journey and give us different aspects of his life as a kind of commemoration. We can move on. And this slide, this was a collaboration working with the lone existing kufiya factory in Al Khalil, Palestine, in Palestine. Much of the production of kufiyas as we know them is now done overseas and not in Palestine. This was a really intriguing project. It involved one of our members documenting with video and interviewing the owner of the shop and members of the Herbawi family who are still working this factory. It is still possible to buy these original kufiyas, and the factory is still going strong. The premise for the project was twofold. We were asked by an organization, a Lebanese woman actually, friend of the collective, who was in Norway, wanting to make sure that people there were aware that there was a difference between an original kufiya and one that they might find, a counterfeit, if you want, for a better term, and also making sure that if something is manufactured or is bought from Palestine, that it is not something boycottable, that it is done by Palestinian labor. And so the project was also going to be targeted to Beiruti storefronts and shops where, fake kufiya are sold to tourists and that kind of thing. And the project involved calligraphy, the woodcut that you see, photography, video, interviews, and a lot of back and forth. And we produced this poster in, I think, 4 languages.
I think that those are the 4 images. So let's we jumped right in. Maybe we should take like one step back And because my guess is that almost, or at least the majority of people who are watching don't speak Arabic.
Sure.
So maybe you could tell us what Jamaa al-Yad means and where the name comes from.
Sure. So maybe a little bit taking a further step back. I was born in Lebanon. From the age of 5, I grew up in New Jersey in the States, Lenni Lenape in Delaware territories, and then 2004 I had a desire to go back, and went back. Was teaching at the American University there, and at the same time researching the history and trajectory of artist collectives and cooperatives, what brought them together, what kept them together, but also what undid them. And the idea was, through the research, to reestablish links to what to me was quite valid culture, but in a colonial institution like the American University, kind of set aside for the idea that we need to appeal to the West somehow, for want of a better term. So in 2007, we started working on forming the collective. We went to some lawyers because it had to be officially done and registered with the government. We were presented with bylaws and charter, well, a template for bylaws and charter that were in French, if I remember correctly. Obviously, NGOs predominate in the country, and so the legal aspect of things focused on an NGO model, but it included everything we didn't want to include: 50% plus one voting, quorum, non-consensus based way of working, election of officers, all of these things. And when I said I don't want this, we're non-hierarchical, we're open, we all, we want to work based on a consensus model, we were informed that we would have to write our own bylaws and charter. And so that was a process that took about 2 years. Our approval came through in record time. Normally that can take a year or two, but we were approved in a couple of months, I think, because of our focus on local culture. Jamaa al-Yad comes from a root which gives us words that mean university or congregation. It's a reference to Friday congregating for prayer, for example, assembly, coming together, literally. And yad means hand, and so Jamaa al-Yad means hand coming together. But so it technically means, denotatively means clenched fist, but it resonates with so much that exemplifies us in terms of hand-based craft, as well as kind of coming together to produce these works.
Such a beautiful way of articulating the idea of the clenched fist as a sort of gathering of hands.
Yeah, it's funny in a way because, Arabic resonates linguistically in ways that are harder to, I feel like when I explain it in English, I've taken the clockworks apart and it doesn't mean anything anymore, but you get the idea of what that means.
Yeah. So you are in Vancouver now, and I know a number of other members are in North America, or sort of the group has become diasporic in a lot of ways. But simultaneously, a lot has been going on in Lebanon and in Beirut in particular. How are you now sort of relating to the collective work, the sense of place, the focus on the local, and like, what do you, maybe like we can start with a little bit of that, and then maybe towards the end we can then get to the like what's next kind of question. But I'm really interested in, how do we, like, if we're going to talk about collectivity in a world that's increasingly erratic and difficult, then we need to think about what that looks like across borders and time zones. So how are you negotiating and navigating that?
Yeah, it's a really great question, and it's a difficult one to answer, if only because the events of recent times have just been so completely overwhelming in so many ways. And whereas it's interesting, I was conversing with a former colleague and dear friend of mine, and kind of reminiscing as I was preparing for this, like pulling together some stuff just for my own memory. And I shot him an email, and he said, yeah, remember the good old days when, resistance was organic and not reactive, in the sense of now, with especially with the port explosion and the ongoing strikes that have been taking place in the country, the bombing again of Gaza, everything, the war in Syria. I mean, it starts to take on a level of, well, how I often frame it is, there are no words. Like, there's nothing to say now. And so I know in my heart that, as the Palestinians say, existence is resistance, and you move forward. Then on top of everything, COVID and it's heartbreaking in a lot of ways. When friends and family are saying to me, keep your memories and don't come back, it's really hard to hear that kind of thing. And the emigrating impulse of the Lebanese, which is historically part of that region, is just kicking again into high gear. I can remember when I was teaching, there was a year or two where students stopped planning to leave the country. The desire was to stay and to build and to work and all of that kind of thing. And now we find ourselves kind of spread out all over. The old idea of having a space to work in and share, and that type of taller or studio or atelier, however you want to call it, serving as a locus of action, has kind of been undone. And it's harder now to speak in the generic, meaning when an email goes out to the group and we're talking about a project, in the face of what's going on in the country now, where medicine is running out, gasoline is running out, the crises, one leading to the other, the already feeble infrastructure of the country just coming completely undone, it ends up everything becomes quite specific. And that idea of a friend of mine just returned from Gaza. He was there for well, he wanted to just visit family he hadn't seen in 10 years. And when the bombing started again, I was sending him emails, like the old things, the things you would say previously, all the words you would use in terms of perseverance and steadfastness and patience in the face of adversity, they don't mean anything. And I would say to him, I don't have words for you. And so I actually started resorting to quotations from Palestinian poets, just those who had previously gone through similar situations, and pulling from them a kind of strength. And those are turning into projects now, illustrated posters using the words of particular poets, for example. So I don't know if I'm answering your question. I think in diaspora mode, there are two levels to it. One is dealing with the day-to-day of where you are, which is often a place xenophobic, racist, Islamophobic, whatever the case may be, and then kind of pining for a life that you had, but knowing that life is gone. And so kind of trying to balance those in a way that allows for activism to keep moving forward. I mean, I remember in 2010, was the socialism conference in Oakland. It was right after the Oscar Grant trial, and there was a member of the Black Panther Party there, and I said to him, how do you keep doing this? Like, brothers and sisters arrested or assassinated, whatever the case may be. And he looked at me and he said, I may not see the revolution in my lifetime, but I need to carry the flag forward to those who are coming up after me. And that has stuck with me. And there are similar resonances there with phrasings and words especially from the Palestinians. So that's what I try to keep in my heart.
If we take that anecdote, your conversation with the former Panther, and then we sort of jump back to 2010 when Jay you did your first big action, which was this newspaper supplement. And we've talked about this in the past, in which this supplement that was put in a major newspaper to advertise and promote and to sort of generate discussion around Israeli Apartheid Week, that project created this moment, or maybe better phrasing, a space in which younger people who were a part of that for the first time ever were having conversations with their parents about the activism and organizing and agitprop that they had been doing during the Lebanese Civil War 30 years, 25 years earlier. Can you maybe tie some of this this very intense moment we're having back into trying to do work that speaks to the ability to have an intergenerational conversation that does allow, at least for the possibility of looking backward in order to move forward?
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting going back to what my friend Rami said to me, the organic days of resistance. And by that, I take it to mean if you will, the alternative infrastructure existed, meaning there were still printers and pressmen working with metal type. There were still small presses. Our idea when we approached Al Akhbar newspaper, I had no. I mean, you remember these days also, like the Lower West Side, the printing district of Manhattan, and being able to go to a small press and saying, can we swap out our plates at the end of your press run and use up the rest of the paper and ink? And the printer is amenable to that because, the cleanup is a little bit less because there's less on the press. And I imagine maybe getting 500 copies of our supplement out of that run. And so when the counteroffer came, we'll print up one for every newspaper, which numbered about 12,000 in terms of circulation. Kind of blown away, but happily recalling those days of the quite local printer and the print shop as a site of activism and community mindedness and all of that kind of thing. So for the posters, we included, just to give a little bit of context, we included a recipe for wheat paste. There were 8 posters. None of them was backed with another poster. They were each a free page in the newspaper. So these went out with the left-wing newspaper Al Akhbar. And the idea was people would activate them on the street, cook up some wheat paste and put these up. And some of the students reported their parents who had been trying to protect them from politics and protect them, kind of shelter them from what they had lived, were all of a sudden coming forward with these stories of how they had worked and what they had done during the Civil War. And so there was this generational bonding, if you will. And I think the fact that, at first we lamented, we didn't see any of the posters out, but it turned out that people were hoarding them. The tradition of the poster is so strong, and the resonance of that supplement hit so many spots. Nobody wanted to get rid of them, and so they held on to them, which is fine. But to your point, I think everything all of our projects, when you take a look at our projects on the website, each one is framed historically, politically, culturally, and a lot of that emphasis is on the historical. And so instead of thinking of a unique incident or moment in time that needs a response, seeing it as a continuum of moments that need a response and a continuum of activism, then it's less overwhelming in a way. You're part of a bigger project, and it's no accident that especially within academia, theories of I don't know how to frame it, whether we call it postmodernism or otherwise, the idea that the new is always better and we're always moving forward, and history needs to be kind of done away with in that level, this becomes problematic. So I would end by saying whether that would be possible today, I'm not so sure. And so that's what I start to notice has been lost a little bit, that alternative infrastructure in Beirut. So many of our projects when I was still there, they manifested in a way that included just people coming out, networked people coming out of the woodwork, coming together in no official way, in no formalized way. But all of those networks were latent to just the way the culture works. And so when you have these overwhelming crises, if you will, then the networks need to be used for other things, and people are less inclined to divert from that. And so that's where I see things right now. I'm trying to maintain, I don't know how else to put it, like maintain a sense of moving forward and continuing our projects. But I think they will likely take on a different tenor and a different manifestation. I think they also need to do the job now of perhaps recreating those networks or going back and making sure that they're still intact. This is what I've started working on as a kind of side project now.
I mean, this dovetails into something that has been running through all of these conversations since February, which is it may seem oblique at first, but it'll come back around. I'm really interested in sort of how political movements negotiate and navigate ideas around intellectual property, and a sort of tradition of political graphics that on the one hand is communal, and on the other hand, there's often people who are sort of enclosing it in different ways, claiming authorship, whether those are individual artists or whether those are sort of corporate or state entities. And it sort of brings me your print, this idea of the print shop as a locus of resistance. It makes me think about, I think it was about a decade ago, a little less than a decade ago, I was working with a local chapter of Al Auda in Chicago around a march and sort of cultural celebration for the right of return. And I designed a graphic for them, for t-shirts and for flyers. And, we brought the graphic to the printer, I don't know, maybe 2 weeks before the event. And then unbeknownst to us, the printer, who is a printer in the Palestinian community in Chicago, back channeled the graphic to a printer friend on the West Coast. And then I just happenstance between turning that graphic in and then that demonstration went to DC there was a big anti-war march, because this is like 2002, so this is right after September 11th. And I see a guy marching down the street with my t-shirt design, but in different colors. And I was like, where did that come from? And he's like, oh, I got it in the Bay Area from, and I got back to Chicago and I was like, what is going on? And friends of mine were like, oh, this is just what happens like within old school Arab culture, is that there isn't the same sense of copyright. that like this is a graphic that's useful, so I'm going to send it on to people that I think can make use of it. Wouldn't have even crossed that printer's mind that they should have asked about that. Or I mean, I took it as a point of pride. It was in no way offended by it, but I could see how other people would be. And I'm interested in this how this maybe gets at a question of like, okay, maybe some of the infrastructure is gone, but if the mindset is still the same, then maybe there's still a space for this kind of back channel liberation work within print shops when they do reemerge. Or like, how do we, and how do you personally, and how does the collective negotiate these questions around intellectual property, communal, visual, identity, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think from the very beginning, I remember discussing this with you at one point, perhaps when you were visiting us there or visiting Beirut. It came up as a discussion, and we were looking at the poster tradition of OSPAL and Cuba, and how the temptation of fame in North America would often cause artists to break away or to insist that their work be signed or that kind of thing, and kind of leave the group. And so that's a part of it. But we discussed, do we give credit? Do we place our names anywhere on our work? And the collective was like, well, no, absolutely not. This is collective work, and then some, and it, on some level it makes sense, because in some, especially high energy moments of working, one person would do a drawing, someone else would carve it, someone else is doing the calligraphy or the square Kufic lettering, and someone's doing the graphic design. And so it just became all hands on deck. But all of our work has always ever been placed on the website free for people to use. And like you're saying, whether it's a poster that shows up in some remote town in Mexico that I hear back about, or whether, during the Great March of Return, the images we put up were showing up as station identification on television coverage of the event. They were huge banners and billboards, and the trip down, as we were bussing down, I was like, that's not how people were adding color, and like you're saying, it's like, that's interesting. And then we got down there, and people had made signs with them and everything like that, and it's just part of how that works. The idea of that dissemination and that need for getting the message out, kind of precluding, even the glimmer of an idea of, hey, wait a minute. And I have to say, if we look at copyright and intellectual property as being functional to ideas of property and ownership, and usually corporations who are manifesting for what they can squeeze out of use and that kind of thing, it never was a question that we needed to make it known that this was our work. But it's interesting too, I think there's also, I don't know how to put it, there are certain things we haven't seen. Like, I haven't seen t-shirts other than the ones we've created, for example. So maybe there's a bar of understanding there as to what is doable. If it's part of the action, I don't know. It's a really great question. And I think, like I said, it's interesting to me to see through the statistics for the website where things are going on based on who's hitting our pages and from where and what's being downloaded. That's a whole other side of it. And I've often wanted to put onto all of the things we've put up, and a request, please document and send us back footage or photographs or whatever the case may be. But just being happy that at any given time, one aspect of our work is being downloaded and reproduced, and disseminated.
I mean, this question around intellectual property, who owns a visual language, is really embedded in the larger project that I'm doing as part of this Colgate residency, which is really exploring the idea that over the past 200 years, that we, like collectively humanity in a way, has created a shared left iconography that exists in a way like a language, that it has almost letter forms that get combined and recombined in different ways. And I wanted to get your thoughts on this, but also in the context of thinking about the importance of the local to your work, but at the same time, if you look at the collective's output, you see fists and doves and prison bars and slingshots and these icons that make up almost letter forms of a kind of language, visual language of liberation. How do you feel about the sort of potential internationalism of this language, but also maybe the limits and how things maybe mean different things in different local contexts, or where we reached a point in which there's a certain universality that we can use as shorthand, that this is almost like a left folk idiom.
Yeah, it's a really great question. Well, first I would say so much of what we do historically ties back to days of literal decolonization and liberation movements that were cross-purpose and bridging with each other and sharing information in a time when that was no easy feat, right? And the iconographic imagery that came out of that era was one of not ownership, but sharing. If I look at something like the Lotus magazine that came out of the Afro-Asian Writers Organization, and those ideas of we're not going to translate the language, we are speaking to a particular audience, and then having a printer in Beirut or Cairo kind of adding embellishments and illustrations to that, and that not being a problem. And so kind of a universal notion of common struggle tied at certain points with most local references. And you know, like any language, references can be learned. In our local context, if I think of Greater Syria, symbolism takes on huge import, like it does everywhere, but in the sense that if you look at, say, the tradition of the Palestinian poster, the tropes and idioms and representative symbols just become this amazing constant referencing that obviates the need to explain or to add a lot of text, or to, you know, with one symbol. And, you know, Arabic as a language is brilliant in the way it is able to resonate along these lines. Like the series of posters that we did, we took 8 Lebanese proverbs and tied them to illustrations of everyday Palestinian life in a way that kind of played with the proverb, but proverbs are still part of the living language. These are things that are said all the time. And so those references tied in a new context became quite compelling, I think. The other thing to note, especially for us, was we were working in a place which proudly, sadly, claims that it is trilingual, when in fact it's not. And so most work would be translated in the same poster and be representing French, English, and Arabic. And we made a decision very early on if we need to be talking over the heads of those who don't understand the language, we're going to do that. And I think that's one of the things that has worked to our advantage. We don't mind producing, say, a series of posters that are in different languages, but we don't, to translate is to water down and to move away from something that has huge meaning. And so we're not, we see our audience as most local. And so my work here continues along those lines. Like I see in my students often a desire to speak to the local audience. And my question is always, what's your acculturation? Whom do you want to speak to? They may be elsewhere. You're not obliged to pantomime or act out or translate. Again, going back to that analogy of a clock that you've taken apart, you get a sense of how it works, but it's not working anymore. So I feel like the aspects of our work that speak to the most local, if you will, are also, like you said, working with those tropes that just resonate. You know, it's no accident. Excuse me. It's no accident to me that particular places, whether Andalusia and the El Andalus in Spain, or South America, places in South America, all of a sudden become interested in our work and get in contact, and there's a back and forth. You know, places of resistance, places of revolution, understand that language and speak it readily. I don't know if I'm answering your question, Josh.
I mean, yeah, I mean, it's more a terrain in a way than a question. So, and maybe, you know, we're running out of time, but there isn't a pile of questions yet. So maybe we can squeeze one more in, and then DeWitt will take it over and see if any of the students have anything they want to add. But I'm really interested in the way that you and the collective have sort of attempted to reinvigorate this idea of the Kufi script, which is a pictorial, in a way, a pictorial Arabic, pictorial calligraphy, and how it's interesting how this almost like allows you to get away from this tension between image and language by actually integrating the two into one. And like, what is some of the ideas behind that? And I know that there's a whole backstory that about the way that Arabic calligraphy is used or abused in the Lebanese context. So maybe just a little bit on that, and then we can see if anyone else wants to jump in.
Yeah, sure. The square kufik traditionally comes from architecture, and so a square tile that needs to be put into use to represent Arabic formed a school, if you will, of how to approach Arabic that is rectilinear. It's used extensively, mostly in marketing and advertising. It's bold and graphic, and so companies will turn to it for logos and that kind of thing. But it also has, you know, those resonances of faith, and also the ability to just play with the language in a really amazing way. On a personal note, I was coming back to Lebanon, and so was learning Arabic. To learn calligraphy, you're talking years of apprenticeship for all the different schools to look into. And then, how to put it, you're in a place which doesn't have any schools, active schools of calligraphy anymore. And so, or I don't know, I'm trying to recall historically if it ever did. So it ended up allowing us to get away from certain trends within the graphic design realm in Lebanon. So the idea of somebody taking, I don't know, Frutiger or Baskerville and making the Arabic version of it, which to me, I don't know what to say to that. Does it, I mean, yeah, but it's not, it's so problematic on so many levels. And so the square kufik, and you can see in our work, our first attempts, and many of them were mine, kind of stumbling and clumsy, and it has grown, and you kind of make up your own rules as to how you want to portray letters and letter forms. And it kind of takes on a life of its own. But as you're saying, often it sits there kind of in the background, often needing help or input as to what it communicates, especially when it starts turning on itself. But I like that idea of something a little bit more subliminal, if that makes sense, or something that carries through, that speaks to those who know and doesn't say anything to those who don't. To me, it's quite powerful, and the ability to, I'll also say, the ability to quickly turn something around along those lines is really great. We have used some friends of the collective who are active as calligraphers and work as calligraphers to do like the water is life calligraphy that we did. That was a colleague of the collective who did that piece for us. But again, not asking for attribution or presenting or signing it in any way. It just became the work of the collective.
I mean, you can call it clumsy, but I mean, I regularly wear the shirt that you produced for the Malcolm X play that has Malcolm's name and in sort of recognition in the Kufic X, and every single time I wear it, someone stops me and asks me about it.
we have
profoundly arresting as an image.
Well, it was, how to put it, it's what, and you know what this is like, working as a graphic designer or whatever the case may be, that moment when something just clicks and works and you're like, okay, this can't be anything else and this is just perfect the way it is. That was one of those moments. And I think the most heartening aspect of it is, we've produced it as a t-shirt. I'm trying to get them back up on the website because we have a ton of them. And but the fact that they sell out in Beirut as much as Dearborn, for example, or another city with a large, not just Arab population, but Black population, for example, is so heartening to me that the symbolism of bridging between communities and allowing for that kind of back and forth and resonance is really quite powerful. And that image in particular, really, I don't say this too often, but really proud of that. It clicked in a way that we were really happy with, and really happy to hear all of these stories of, every once in a while, one of the members will circulate something on our list, usually from Detroit or Dearborn, somebody working in the community support sector, however you want to describe it, wearing that t-shirt. And, there's no higher honor. I don't know what to say.
Yeah. So it's 5:30. I don't know, DeWitt, do you want to sort of take it away and
Sure.
see if there's any, looks like there's one question in the list, but maybe there's some of the students have questions.
Yeah, let's take a couple. The first one from Zoom. It seems to me that this is from Edward Zhang. It seems to me that a lot of the collective's work is overtly political with purpose. My question, though, is a little bit meta. Does the speaker believe that all art is political in nature, or that the artist's choice to make something political or apolitical?
A really great question. Thank you, Edward. I go through this as an instructor. I'm teaching here at Emily Carr University, professor of illustration, but often dealing with, say, painting students or other students, printmaking students, that kind of thing. And the Pacific Northwest School of Painting is one of formalist tradition, mark making, really getting into the medium, and the political gets pushed to the side. I'm of the opinion that something that doesn't speak to resist the dominant cultural mode is part of the dominant cultural mode, and we can argue that that is equally political, if you will. That's how I see it. I think we're in a time now where those that ability to remove oneself from the fray and to speak in a kind of meta way, or to speak to a rarefied audience, I don't know that we have that ability anymore. And I'm having conversations now with colleagues and students whereas maybe 2 years ago, these kind of I don't want this to come out as a judgment, but more rarefied kind of conceptual explorations, they don't meet the current crises that are taking place globally. And so on that level, to ignore what's going on and produce artwork of that type, to me is a political decision. You've made a choice where you fit in terms of your economic, political embodiment, however you want to frame it. Yeah.
Thank you. Any questions for our in-person audience? Yes.
So if I understand this correctly, Jamaa is a movement that aims to resist the oppressions that's happening to the people. These people can be like in the region, in the Middle East, specifically like Syria and Lebanon and Palestine, like they can be a group of people in other places, I guess, for example. And it concerns about like bringing attention to these issues and giving those people hope to keep going and resisting. And I just like want to ask how, from your perspective, what do you think is the effect of your work on like these people and on the outside world, on how they perceive these people? If this clear.
Did you be able to hear that, Danny?
Yeah, I heard that. Thank you. It's a really good question. Like I was saying before, historically, really just tying ourselves into precursive movements, if you will, or the continuum of art and activism, as opposed to seeing it as something separate that exists, really seeing it as the embodiment of, or what's a better word, the manifestation of what's going on the ground, as opposed to, we don't see ourselves as a group that is kind of out here observing what's taking place. You know, it's stuff that's lived, gets communicated and activated that way. When you look back at the tradition of, especially during the 60s and 70s, of the decolonization and the movements for liberation, such a rich, you know, so much rich material that we don't see ourselves separate from. We see a continuing of a tradition, and it's not just local to the region, but it's really worldwide. So, you know, for example, Vijay Prashad has resuscitated in no small way the idea of the tricontinental, and each newsletter comes with a collection of artists working in different parts of the world along liberatory and emancipation lines. It's phenomenal. And knowing that that work is out there kind of creates a sustaining feedback link, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Just to follow up, I mean, there was at the end of the gentleman's question, there was this question about like reception or critical evaluation. I mean, does that, I mean, what are your criteria for success, I guess, right? Or impact, maybe.
Wow. This is an amazing question. So I remember when we were working on that poster series at the very beginning, and one of my, you know, in my office at the American University, some people doing scratchboards, some people carving linoleum, some people doing the graphic design, all of this deadline pressure. And one of the students kind of looked up and said, what if nobody sees this? Like, what if nobody observes or responds to it? And I said, you know, if there are 12,000 copies of this newspaper and it all gets ignored, and one poster ends up in the room of one young Palestinian person and inspires them, it will have been worth it. And that came back to me when, you remember, Josh, when the MoMA did a retrospective 9+1, I can't remember the title of their exhibition, but it was based on the Occupy movement. And so the poster we did for the Occupied Wall Street Journal showed up on the first floor of MoMA, And all of my former students who are in New York started taking selfies like, "You've made it, we've made it." And I was like, that's going to be gone in 2 months. No one's going to remember it. And yet the posters we did over a decade ago are still up on the walls of the refugee camps in Lebanon. And so when you ask me how we view our success, to me, if there's a resonance with somebody and a feeling of elevation or carrying forward, that's all we need. I mean, we've been in gallery spaces in Europe and other things like that, but that to me is much more ephemeral than the long-term existence of our posters, say in refugee camps and stuff like that.
Thanks. We've got one more question online. This is from AM Codes ? This is interesting to think about in this context, which is graphically amazing. Can you talk more about subliminal communication?
Yeah, subliminal probably wasn't the right word to use. I think the way I frame it for myself, growing up in the States and then going back to Lebanon and then coming back again and now being in Canada, and the kind of, code is a great word, the kind of code switching that needs to take place, what I'm allowed to say, what I need to be quiet about, the tone I carry, especially in Canada, the Jersey boy inside wants to scream half the time, but that's not allowed. So it ends up being problematic. Subliminal, so the way I frame it with students is, who's your audience? If you're in a room of people looking at your work, are you obliged to talk to them? If I'm working on a project and I'm targeting it, I go back to Malcolm X. Whenever you look at his interviews and these kind of prodding, targeted questions, he's always talking above the head of the interviewer. I mean, literally, he's talking above the heads of a first row in the auditoriums that he's speaking in of the American Nazi Party, who are sitting there with their arms crossed in full regalia and swastikas and everything. So I'm in the presence of someone speaking, but I'm communicating above their head to somebody behind them. How does that change my work? How does that change how I feel about my work? A lot of the research that went into this actually went back to ideas of minstrelsy in the days of vaudeville, when Black actors replacing the white actors who used to put blackface on themselves were obliged to wear blackface and also speak in the Pidgin dialect that had been created for them, because that's what the audience was expecting. And this I find, heartbreaking and infuriating at the same time. And so how do I avoid that? How am I true to myself and to my work and to my audience? And if somebody wants to understand, then the onus is on them as opposed to the artist who's creating.
I'm gonna dive in real quick to it and just add that I think that whether we want to use the word subliminal or not, it is important that we acknowledge that we all, at this point, especially with social media and staring at our phones all the time, we're awash in visual language and are poorly equipped generally to be able to sort of interpret it. We learn how to read and write, and we don't really learn how to read images, and images carry immense amounts of resonances with them. And so we read things that we don't even realize we're reading. And advertisers are, of course, are the sort of the real hands at this, but I think that there's lots of really great examples in that we can draw from and use ourselves for how this has been used in liberation movements and can continue to be used. So, if a graphic has a person in it with an afro, at this point, most, people will associate that with a sort of 70s Black radicalism. And then that reference gets drawn into the interpretation of the image without us even realizing that we're doing that. And there's literally thousands of ways that happens all the time. And I think that it's long time that people who are doing agitprop for political movements and social movements today really get better at for lack of a better term, sort of weaponizing that to our advantage.
I think it's a great point, and I would only add that to understand is that it's been co-opted in many ways, and so the facade of activism is often there in imagery that contains nothing in the way of valid activation. And the flip side is true too. I've been, it's stunning to see, and I'm saying this as someone, I was born in Lebanon, adopted to the United States, went back as an adoptee, to see the images of US soldiers holding babies, like this trope of the baby lift and the saving of children after a war, whether it be the Vietnam War or the Korean War, as we call them, wars of aggression against nation states in East Asia and other places. That trope, we also need to be able to unpack them and understand them historically, and the weight they carry, and the effortlessness with which the dominant cultural mode just throws them out there without assuming that anyone's out there to be critical of them or to challenge them in any way.
Thank you. One last question.
Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering, it sounded like you were not against translation, but were more into staying in that original trope. And so I was wondering if you how you plan to reach farther audiences that don't understand that, or if your only goal is to inspire the people that understand that language to take activism for themselves.
Really good question. I think it's a starting point. Well, again, I'll say, like, if you take a look at the website and the projects, many of the posters have been translated. So the starting point is Arabic, but there's a sense, a need in the Lebanese context to translate into the two other predominant colonial languages, which are English and French. And then beyond that, we often translate into Spanish. Ideally, that can continue. It's purely a function of time and ability, because what I'm reading into your question is it is possible for others to understand and have something resonate with them, and that image is often the starting point. So in many ways, the desire to not translate came from not wanting to follow what was expected in terms of, say, the Lebanese graphic design context, which is 3 languages in one poster often, and given equal balance, even though the majority of the country speaks Arabic. It is the national language, after all, even though a lot of education takes place in English and French. I think I'm answering your question. There is always that need to, well, and then taking into account the fact that many of us are acculturated in other languages, and so a mother tongue that perhaps isn't Arabic, and it kind of expresses a desire to recapture that and go back to that. And it's interesting, many of my students, whether from immigrant or migrating contexts, or indigenous students, or others looking to recapture language, my answer is always to throw yourself into it and then don't do the translation as a empowerment, a way of empowering oneself, if that makes sense.
I think it's important to acknowledge that translation is not a neutral activity. I mean, you may be attempting to move A to B, but that not only is it not neutral, but there's more than one direction. And I'm not assuming that the person asked this question was saying this, but I think it is fair to say that a lot of people in the Anglophone world perceive translation as a problem for others. How come other people aren't translating what they're doing so that we can understand it?
Yeah.
I mean, more books are published in English than any other language by astronomical amount, yet the least number of books are translated into English. I mean, there's just an utter lack of interest for the most part in other languages, yet you find huge percentages of books published in other countries with other tongues are translations from English texts. So just as a meta thing, translation is used in an imperialist fashion to move ideas from the Anglophone world into other parts of the world rather than the other way around.
It's a really good point, and I would only follow up and say, there. And again, I'm not throwing this on the questioner. It's a great question, but oftentimes there's with that weight of, or with that expectation that it be translated into English, for example, is a sense that if I don't understand it, then it doesn't exist. Or if I don't understand it, it's not worthy of existence. And so in the same way as you're saying, kind of challenging the imperial canalization of how translation works in publishing and otherwise, also taking a stand and saying, this doesn't need to be, for you to understand this requires effort on your part, not our part.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Josh. Thanks. It's great to have these conversations starting again. And Josh, we're really looking forward to you being on campus. And Daniel, all be well in Vancouver.
Thank you. Great to be
Well,
here.
thank you everybody for coming.